Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And for those of you who are here for the first time or don't come too often, if you'd like to be on our newsletter list, there is a sign-in sheet out in the hall. Help yourself. We only send you one email a week, and it's chock full of good stuff. I have a lot of announcements today, and so please bear with me. But I'd like to first open by acknowledging that the University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land that was ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851, and the IAS acknowledges this relationship, and it's one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and with each other. And the IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. We have an open position for an early career scholar. This is of Indigenous Studies. This is a 2-year position as part of our Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funded grant on environmental stewardship, place, and community. Applications will be reviewed starting February 14th. The position is open until filled. So spread the word, disseminate it to your circles. There is a link to the position description and application information on the IAS website. So next week, as part of the Spotlight series, the ongoing themed series on environmental justice, that's a collaboration of the IAS and Northrop and the University Honors Program. Our IAS Thursday in Best Buy upstairs, I almost did that wrong, didn't I, is going to be a conversation between Amy Whitman from the McKnight Foundation and Paul Odegaard from the Minneapolis Foundation. So please come. We'll be upstairs on the first floor, on the fourth floor in the Best Buy theater. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Debra Harry to the University of Minnesota. She is doing a marathon stretch of generosity with her time and her expertise. Yesterday she was up speaking at University of Minnesota Duluth, today here for the IAS. This evening, she'll be with the Decolonization Roundtable, and tomorrow morning, she's presenting a talk on Back to Indigenous Futures, Data Sovereignty, and Indigenous Knowledge, which will be on the West Bank in the Carlson School. And I also particularly want to thank the Office of Public Engagement and the Decolonization Roundtable for co-sponsoring her visit. So, Dr. Debra Harry is Numu tukadu from Pyramid Lake, Nevada. She earned her PhD in the Faculty of Education at the University of Auckland under the supervision of renowned Maori scholar Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Dr. Harry is currently a faculty member in the Gender, Race, and Identity program at the University of Nevada, Reno. Her research analyzes the linkages between biotechnology, intellectual property, and globalization in relation to Indigenous peoples' rights. She's authored numerous articles related to the protection of Indigenous peoples' biodiversity and traditional knowledge, including law review articles on biocolonialism and Indigenous knowledge in United Nations Discourse, and Indigenous peoples and gene disputes. She also contributed a chapter titled Acts of Self-Determination and Self-Defense, Indigenous Peoples Responses to Biocolonialism, in a volume edited by Sheldon, Krimsky, and Peter Shorett called Rights and Liberties in the Biotech Age. In 1994, Dr. Harry received a 3-year National Kellogg Foundation National Leadership Fellowship, which she used to study the field of human genetic research and its implications for Indigenous people. So that is part of the foundation of her talk today, and as you can see, this is something she has been thinking and researching deeply for quite some time. Dr. Harry.
thank you so much for that kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Great to see such a nice crowd of people who came to hear a talk about biocolonialism. Like, who does that? You know, such an obscure subject matter, and I'm glad to see that you're here and that you're interested, and in particular in today's day and age, and when we have a lot of kind of common issues that we need to look at, and maybe we haven't analyzed them from an Indigenous perspective, which has been my work for quite some time now. Let me just introduce myself properly. Nu Debra Harry Minania, nu Kooyooe Dakota, nu Kooyooe Pat, Bija Divino I Numurui I Nania, Quina Pukot. So I said, good afternoon, my relatives. My name is Debra Harry. I come from a place called Pyramid Lake, but it's actually Kooyooe Pat. That's our name for the place. And it's named after a fish that's endemic to Pyramid Lake called the Kooyooe. And so my people, my band of Numu, are known as Kooyooe Dakota. We're the Kooyooe eaters. And then I also said that my other name, my spiritual name, is Chief Eagle Horse Woman. And I think that speaks to a little bit about my own, like my center, my spiritual self. The name came from ceremony, and it really is kind of the direction that I've taken in my life, and that is to fly high and see far ahead and look at the issues facing Indigenous peoples, and then bring that information home. And so the whole issue of biocolonialism, genetic theft, was not something I chose for myself. It wasn't something that I thought, well, that's what I really want to work on when I grow up. But it's managed to take over some 30-odd years of my life, and I've dedicated a lot of time to the subject matter. But today, I'm going to kind of do a sketch on biocolonialism. I'm not going to go into too much depth on it, but I want to talk more about the contextualization of it as a process, as a phenomenon that impacts colonized peoples and takes place in colonial settler contexts. And so I want to kind of end with that in terms of situating the issue and some of the things that have taken place within the issue of biocolonialism and how I see it related to this broader context. I too would like to acknowledge the organizers of this event, my hosts who have been so gracious, Vince Diaz and Tina Delisle, and all of your staff and team here has been wonderful. It was a real treat to travel with you yesterday and to go up to the University of Minnesota Duluth yesterday. It was a beautiful drive. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I understand that I'm in the homelands of the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples, and so I acknowledge the ancestors of this land, the people of this land today. So, 1990, I start to see these articles coming out about a new global research project called the Human Genome Diversity Project. And I get a call from the MacArthur Foundation that wants to bring together a small workshop of people to respond to a proposal that they had received from this particular project, and they wanted to see what Indigenous people thought about it. And so they brought together a roundtable of the Human Genome Diversity Principles and myself and some other Indigenous activists from around the country to come and sit with them and to hear more about their project, and then to have a discussion about what they were doing. And so I think I was already, tapped on the shoulder because I had already written a bit about the Human Genome Diversity Project. I had already heard about it. I had already raised concerns and had written in some small publication about Indigenous concerns about this project, and so I was invited there. And one of the other people who was there was a good friend of mine, Dr. Frank Dukapu. And he is the first Native American geneticist in the country. He's Hopi, and he passed way too early at the age of 54. But I met him there, and we began working together to take a look at this particular project and then subsequent projects. And we were really looking at the ethical, legal, and the social implications of this kind of research on Indigenous peoples. And Frank himself was doing genetic work. He was looking at albinism among Hopi people. And he was based at Northern Arizona University, and he had basically put his research on hold so that he could take a look at these broader issues. And you can imagine if you're a scientist and you shelve your own research, right? He received incredible backlash from the scientific community for taking that stand and agreeing to take a look at some of these social issues in a broader context. And so with the Human Genome Diversity Project, we met with the principals, Luca Cavalli-Sforza, very well-known, world-renowned human geneticist, population geneticist. I think one of his books is called something like The Book of Man or something like, I mean, he's done all this research around, a genetic structure for humanity. And he's the founder of the Human Genome Diversity Project. And in 1989, 1990, they started to collaborate with linguists and with anthropologists and with other geneticists who wanted to study diverse populations at the genetic level. And they drew up a list, a target list of 722 indigenous populations that they wanted to go draw blood from, right? Draw blood, take scrapings from the inside of your cheeks, or even take hair root or whatever to try to get genetic samples. And so we called it a target list because that's basically what it was. Indigenous peoples were being treated as objects of research, not partners, that had no role in designing the questions or any of those kinds of things, right, that you would have in ethical research. They were simply targets. They were simply going to be contributors of DNA towards these ends. And so we met with Luca, we met with others of his team. We learned more about their intentions, which pretty much was that, to just go and take samples and nothing more. And their intention to immortalize DNA samples from indigenous populations and keep them in various institutions and keep them viable and available for study by pretty much anyone who wants them. And one of the responses of Luca, when he realized that indigenous peoples were not particularly receptive to his project, was he would say things like, well, look, I'm just a scientist. I'm not a political scientist. I haven't thought about people's reactions to these things. Then they also started to change their position. They started to say things like, well, there could be medical benefits from this research, and we'll end racism by showing that there's no difference in biology in terms of race. So they were going to now end racism and possibly create medical benefits for this research. But I think anyone who does genetics and health-related research knows that you would structure your research very differently than doing this kind of helicopter science where you go in and take in samples and then leave, right? Because if you were studying a health condition, you would work with families, right? You would work with family lineages. It has nothing to do with culture. It has nothing to do with racial identity, indigenous identity, or anything, right? So a lot of the responses that they received from the opposition, which was vast and hard and furious from indigenous people all around the world, just their responses didn't hold water at the end of the day. The other thing that was happening around the same time was the fact that indigenous DNA was becoming the subject of profit motive research, right? And so this is a magazine cover from New York Times Magazine. It says, chasing bad genes to the ends of the earth. the high-tech future of medicine is encrypted in the blood of remote peoples. For the new intrepid gene hunters, there's treasure buried in those veins. And so in the mid-90s, while a lot of the countries and the world's geneticists were focusing on mapping the human genome and kind of deconstructing, you know, the 46 human chromosomes, there was a subset who were looking for genetic difference. And those were the ones that were kind of looking at indigenous peoples as a potential new, unique gene pool to study. And there was a profit motive behind some of this research. Not all of it, but there was certainly a profit motive, and that's what this magazine cover speaks to. And so in 1994, the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services did file a patent application of the DNA of a Guayani woman from Panama. So, I mean, just think about it. Talk about colonial reach, you know, where you have U.S. governmental agencies filing to own and control under exclusive use, using intellectual property tools, the genetic material, the genetic makeup of a Guayani woman from Panama. They also filed an application for the DNA for Solomon Islanders, and then they also applied for a patent over the DNA of a Hakahai person from Papua New Guinea. And so in 1995, I believe, the date's not there, 1996, this patent was actually granted to the National Institutes of Health. And that was the patent over the Hakahai person from Papua New Guinea. And so here you have Carol Jenkins, who was an anthropologist working with this remote community of tribal people in PNG, and at the same time taking blood samples from them, shipping it off to NIH, and what they thought they found was something that might be useful in cancer research, some kind of HDLB type 2 genetic characteristic that they wanted to patent. And it was a characteristic that caused the Hakahai no harm. It wasn't a health issue for them, but it would have been useful in study, and so they wanted to enclose it with a patent and then be able to authorize other people to use it or whatever. And so while all this commercialization is going on, and the Human Genome Diversity Project is saying, but we don't want to patent anybody's genes. We're just good scientists. We just want to study human genetic diversity. This was causing international outrage and a lot of concern in terms of the commercialization of indigenous people's DNA. And so there were debates everywhere at every UN forum talking about, you know, the patenting of indigenous people's DNA. And so all of these things were going on at the same time. And so what the Human Genome Diversity Project began to do was to say that, but we don't really want to patent or commercialize indigenous people's DNA, but if we do, we will make sure that there's benefit sharing with the people we take DNA from. And so that was their, you know, their reaction to the kind of criticisms that they were receiving. So in addition to saying that they were going to combat racism and show that there's no biological basis for race, which by the way has already been done. It was done in the 1970s by, you know, Richard Lewontin and others who said there's no biological basis for race. They've already done that work, you know, in the 1970s. In 1995, Cavalli Sforza was saying, well, we're going to show that there's no difference at the biological level in terms of race. But also what happened was they tried to continue to get funding and support both domestically through the National Research Council, National Science Foundation, and they also went international. They went to UNESCO's International Bioethics Committee, hoping to become the premier global genetic diversity study project there. And they were rejected by all of their peers at these scientific review processes. And the reasons that their peers rejected their proposal is because they said what you're doing is you're conflating biology with race. You're structuring your whole project based on these racial lines, and all it does is reifies race. When we know that there's no, biological basis for race. So while on one hand they're saying they're going to get rid of racism, they were reifying racism with the way their project was structured. So that was just part of it. One of the other big reasons is they said that, how do you operationalize informed consent with vulnerable populations in remote communities, in communities that don't speak the language of genetics? How do you make sure that vulnerable peoples are in a position where they're free from coercion, where they're able to freely give truly informed consent? How do you make that happen? And the National Research Council actually said, you can't. Vulnerable populations are not in a position to give true informed consent just by virtue of being vulnerable populations. They're already at risk. They're already subjected to authoritative power. They cannot give true informed consent. And so, I think we were fortunate in that a lot of these national and international bioethics groups did see some of the holes in the proposals that were being put before them. And Indigenous peoples as well. For Indigenous peoples, it just smacked of absolute colonialism, and objectification. And once again, here comes somebody wanting to take something. But this time it's something very personal, something sacred, a part of our body. And so Indigenous peoples were looking at this project, maybe not so much from the scientific genetic point of view of studying cells and heredity, but from the affront of thinking that somebody is going to come and take something from their personal bodies or from that of their relatives, or even the other element of this research, which is to do destructive analysis on the remains of our ancestors for the virtue of doing comparative analysis with contemporary living groups, which again is even more horrifying, I think, for many Indigenous peoples. And so you have this really, conflicting worldviews, and geneticists. I saw one quote saying, well, a cow is nothing but cells on hooves. People wanting to study DNA, and then Indigenous people saying, well, you're talking about something sacred. And then along comes projects like this one, NatGeo, National Geographic Project. The HGDP kind of went from the big capital letters to the little letters, HGDP. They continue to do research. They have a repository in Paris for the samples that they've collected, but they were never able to garner the international support that they wanted. But it was kind of rebirthed in this project in 2007, I believe, was when it was announced by Spencer Wells, who was the in-house geneticist at National Geographic. And he created a project called the Genographic Project. It was bigger and better. It didn't need public funding because it was privately funded. And guess what? Luca Cavalli-Sforza was Spencer Wells' mentor. So in a way, it was like HGDP reborn, but just in a different package. And so there's a new global project, 100,000 samples from Indigenous peoples all around the world. And they had some other elements like, what NatGeo does, go out and look at exotic Indigenous peoples. And so one of the things they were offering is to people who could afford it to come along and watch us take genetic samples from these remote peoples. And Jonathan Marks was commenting on this. Jonathan is a genetic anthropologist, and in Anthropology News, he says, NatGeo's expeditions now offer the journey of man by private jet. Their solicitation reads, travel in comfort as our VIP outfitted Boeing 757 whisks us to 10 extraordinary destinations in China, Mongolia, Cambodia, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, South India, Southern Africa, Tanzania, and Central France. In addition, your personal DNA can be analyzed, and if you wish, placing your own genetic history within the context of the larger odyssey. You'll begin by meeting Mongolians whose DNA is descended from Genghis Khan, move on to Australia and meet some Aborigines, to Papua New Guinea and Borneo, to India to meet the man who holds the missing genetic link that helped Spencer established our early ancestors' migration from Africa to Australia. We'll travel to Africa to meet San Bushmen, who represented this direct link to your earliest ancestors and the world's last surviving groups of hunter-gatherers. And when you have had your fill of remote poor peoples, you'll end up in the Dorking to dine on the indigenous cuisine of Paraguay truffles. And the cost of traveling around the world in luxury to visit exotic peoples and pretend to be their kin, it can all be yours for $50,000. And this is true. They actually had a brochure, and there was a link on their webpage to be able to pay this amount of money. You could upgrade your room for another $7,500 to go on these expeditions with Spencer Wells. And I'm missing a slide here. Looks like. Sorry about that. But it just gives you a sense of kind of this, this what was taking place, which was outright colonialism, just at a new level. This time at the cellular level, an invasion of our very bodies. And it isn't as if DNA is inert, material. DNA is very personal and it's very sacred. And it contains information about our ancestral lines, and it belongs to future generations, right? And you don't want people tinkering with that. And Indigenous people know that. And Indigenous people know they don't want someone scraping cells or tissue and materials off of the bones of their ancestors to study and to keep in their gene museums. And so they were correct to oppose and to be very vocal in their opposition and to try to stop these projects. I don't know what happened with Spencer Wells to the end of the day. I mean, he's done movies, he continues to do his research, I'm sure. NatGeo was privately funded. They had support from IBM money, they had support from Gateway Computers, at that time. And I don't know what they did with their samples. But I do know that the Diversity Project does continue to maintain these genetic samples. And lest you think that these things are secure, Dr. Dukapu told me that he was at a gathering one time in Harvard, and he said a colleague, a geneticist, came up to him and said, "Oh, we got to check this DNA out." And he pulled a vial of DNA out of his coat and said, "You got to check this out." As if it's just some kind of token, that's meaningless, that has no value. And he was just willing to share and pull it out of his pocket. And so there's a lot of issues with the field: informed consent, secondary uses of samples without consent, actualizing consent. In any ethical research involving human beings, the benefits of the research have to outweigh the risks. And if it can't even meet that basic test, it's unethical. If the human subject does not fully understand all of the risks involved, they cannot give informed consent. And in this scenario, you have researchers who have the onus on them to disclose to their research subjects all of the benefits and all of the risks. In the most remote, vulnerable communities in the world. And so even on film, it has been captured where scientists have said, well, we didn't really bother to tell them that we're doing HTLV typing because they'll never understand it anyway. That's a quote from someone from Hoffman Larache who was on a mission into Colombia in a film called The Gene Hunters. So we didn't tell them, because they'll never understand anyway. That's not informed consent, right? And then you think, well, maybe this is just a third world issue. Well, what about the experience of the Havasupai as recent as 2007, 2010? Havasupai tribe, who had genetic materials taken from them for diabetes research, and then they found out by accident because one of their tribal council people, Carletta Toulouse, went to a dissertation defense and found out that their DNA was being used for all kinds of other research, including schizophrenia, inbreeding, and human migrations, all without their consent. And so they sued, and eventually had a legal settlement with the University of Arizona State University for that abuse. So it's not just happening out there, you know. This is an issue that happens here. And Arizona State University was also not the only implicated institution, because other institutions had also received Havasupai DNA in their laboratories, and they were named in these lawsuits. So, you know, that it's not just a third world issue. And then I wanted to talk a bit about that's human genetic, you know, colonialism. I want to talk about these site of contestations within the United Nations because it's a current debate, it's a current issue, it's a current unsettled question. Who owns genetic material? And in particular, non-human genetic material. And one of the things that my mentor, Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith, says is that Indigenous peoples are at the table because we're considered market players, but we're not quite yet market ready. Okay, we're not quite yet market ready. We offer unique commodities such as traditional knowledge, but we're not quite market ready because their unique commodities have not been made market ready. That is that they have not yet been discovered in the research sense, and in the research sense, nor have they been commercialized in terms of intellectual property. So as long as we're kind of just moving along, using our knowledge in our own communities for our own benefit, right? Teaching our children to live our lives the way Indigenous people do, that's fine. But the minute somebody wants access to that information or to that knowledge or to the biological materials and the knowledge we have about our lands and territories, that's when we're going to be market ready. And that's what these discussions are about. How can states access the biological diversity that we have cultivated since the beginning of time, that we have these deep relationships with, that we have this deep knowledge about? How can they access that? And how can they trade that, maybe with other research partners around the world, mostly first world, because most of the biological diversity is not in the first world, but it's in places like Brazil and, you know, India and all those kinds of places. And then what is their responsibility to give back from whom they've taken from? And so these are current debates that have been taking place in the United Nations. Convention on Biological Diversity, which addresses biological questions of every biological region of the world you can imagine, from deserts to oceans to mountains to forests to inland lakes, islands, and so on. They're addressing the biological diversity issues there. And this is a treaty. This is an international treaty that at least 90 countries of the world have signed on to. The U.S. is not a signatory to this treaty. And the Convention on Biological Diversity has been engaged in negotiating an international treaty for the exchange of genetic resources and indigenous knowledge around the world. And not many indigenous people knew this or know about it. And at the end of the day, what was developed was something called the Nagoya Protocol, adopted in Japan in 2010. And this protocol is like a sub-treaty of the convention. And what it says is that states have absolute sovereignty over all biological resources within their political state. They don't recognize that there are other sovereignties within those political states, like indigenous peoples' lands. And that if they, in their biotechnical work, use indigenous knowledge, that they have an obligation to share benefits for the use of that knowledge, but not for the biological resources that were taken. And so that was passed, and the protocol has received enough signatory states now that it has gone into effect. And now they're implementing the terms of this treaty. What was gutted from it in the negotiations was the right of indigenous peoples to protect their biological materials and to give prior informed consent. Similarly, another negotiation, international negotiation taking place is in the World Intellectual Property Organization, where they're negotiating an instrument or instruments, meaning that there could be one or more treaties developed for the protection of traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and traditional cultural expressions. So that mandate is quite broad, because if you think about traditional cultural expressions, that's pretty much everything that, it's all of our oral histories, it's all of our creation stories, it's about everything that we know about ourselves, it's our cultural heritage. So this treaty is quite broad, and they haven't fully fleshed it out. It follows, surprise, surprise, an intellectual property framework, meaning that the protections are going to be based in Western intellectual property law. And the shorthand would be copyright, trademark, and patent, right? That's the protection, which is no surprise. I mean, the debate is taking place in the World Intellectual Property Organization. Their mandate is to promote and perpetuate intellectual property around the world. That's why it's there, right? And again, not many indigenous peoples know that these negotiations are taking place. And one of the things that they're very clear about is that perpetual protection is not on the table. See, one of the things about intellectual property is that they all have a sunset. They all have an expiration date. For instance, patents expire after 20 years. And once those expiration dates come, what was protected under the intellectual property system goes into public domain, meaning that it now is available and open to all to access. So it no longer belongs to anybody. And so if indigenous peoples now are expected to put our traditional knowledge, our cultural heritage, our biological resources into this protection system, it's really kind of a one-track out of our control, out of our self-determining systems for protection. So that's a real problem. In other words, back to Dr. Smith's quote, indigenous knowledge, cultural heritage, and genetic resources would have been made market ready, right? Market ready means that it's now alienable. It can be bought and sold on the market. You can now license somebody to use it. You have now, using the intellectual property system, you can, it now becomes alienable. And cultural heritage within a cultural context is inalienable, right? It's one of those inherent rights of peoples, just as self-determination is one of the inherent rights of peoples and nations. It's not alienable. You can't buy and sell it. But if you start to use intellectual property system, it becomes alienable. So it actually kind of changes the nature of what's being protected from cultural heritage to a product, right? And then, why indigenous peoples again? I mean, like, why are we, even talking about this? Why are indigenous peoples talking about genetic engineering, genetic, research, and all these kinds of things? We've been brought to the table by virtue of who we are. So it's estimated that there are 370 million indigenous people around the world living in about 90 different countries, and continue to occupy about 20% of the Earth's territory. And out of the 7,000 languages spoken in the world, about 4,000 of those languages are spoken by indigenous peoples. So we really represent a lot of the, the world's cultural diversity as well. Each one of those languages contains a unique body of knowledge that's ancestral, that's old, that's ancient, and belongs to a particular people. And there's a strong correlation between cultural diversity and biological diversity. And it's estimated that indigenous peoples currently guard and nurture and protect about 80% of the world's biodiversity today. And so it's no wonder we're dragged at the table, because that genetic material that's contained within that biological diversity is of interest to somebody, right? It's of interest to somebody who knows how to use genetic traits in their products. And so we're talking about corporations here. These are the gene giants. There used to be 8 gene giants who are working to control the world's seed sources. There's about 3 of them now who control the vast majority of the world's seeds. These are all your food sources, all the different corns, beans, the squashes, the potatoes, peas, rice, all the different kinds of beans and all those kinds of things. And corporations want genetic material, they want genetic traits to be able to put into their new patented product, their new GMO seed, and then to market it under their framework. So what the intellectual property system allows corporations to do is to go out and access this genetic variation, incorporate it into their new product using genetic engineering techniques, and then now they control it because they own the patent. And the patents are written very broadly, so it extends not just to the plant, but to all subsequent generations of that plant that's been genetically engineered. And then they are the sole beneficiaries from the profit made off of those materials. And so indigenous peoples, using their technologies since the beginning of time, have created all these amazing varieties of foods and freely, right? And didn't know they had to protect it from genetic pirates. These are the magic 8 indigenous peoples' contributions to the world: corn, beans, squash, chili, tomatoes, potatoes, vanilla, cacao, probably many more. There's a lot of medicines in our lands and territories that have been appropriated, from our lands and converted into some kind of pharmaceutical product. Center of origin for corn comes from Mexico. Every color you can imagine: blue, black, yellow, white, red. All of those have different traits. Some are drought resistant, some are frost resistant. They have different nutritional makeup. Right? What do we get here? 1 variety, 2 maybe, of Monsanto's corn, Delta and Pines corn, right? So they're interested in that Hopi corn that can be grown by dry farming. They don't have to irrigate. They're interested in that. What's the genetic trait that allows that to grow without much water? Right? That's why you do gene sequencing. That's why you want to study indigenous people's genetic materials. And the legal system allows them to appropriate it. And the global framework allows them and protects their rights at the international level through trade agreements and so on. Taro, kalo, Native Hawaiian people's elder brother. It's not just food. It's not just something you eat. to sustain yourself. This elder brother came first before the people came. And UH wants to patent and to genetically engineer their taro. Native Hawaiians fought. They put up a fight, and they got UH to abandon their patent on this genetically engineered taro. Similar struggle happened here, in this land. Might have even been this institution, I'm not sure, that sought to sequence the genome of wild rice. I don't know what they found in the genome of wild rice. And I don't know if they moved to patent their discovery. And then you repackaged something, right? But you ran into resistance from indigenous peoples. They're sacred food of the Anishinaabe, not just food. It's not just something to eat. It's not just something for sustenance. It's something sacred. As all of these things are. Potatoes. Every color of potato you can imagine comes from the center of origin in the Andean mountains. White, yellow, purple, right? Potatoes, red. Again, potatoes that grow in the shady side of the mountains, and those that grow on the sunny side, and those that grow only at certain elevations in the Andean mountains. And the Quechua people are having to develop their own strategies for protecting their potatoes. They have something called a potato park, which is kind of like a in situ protection strategy, community-based, where they control their seeds and share their seeds, but they don't allow access to those seeds by outsiders. You know, and it's like almost all indigenous peoples have to kind of go on to protection mode here again. And the last piece I want to talk about is the historical context for all of this, because it all has old roots. It didn't just happen overnight. It didn't come with the Biotech Age, right? From the 1970s forward. And for me, I think it's the doctrine of discovery. I think it's the doctrine of discovery, this belief by colonial European societies, Christian societies, countries that believe they have the right to go to other people's lands, non-Christian people's lands, and claim it for themselves, and to take whatever they want from it, and then to settle there, right? And so that's what's affected us in the Americas. That's what affected indigenous peoples in the Pacific and Australia and Asia, Africa, and so on. And the doctrine of discovery is quite well articulated in old law, like, what do they call that? Not common law, but it's, what is it?
Canon law?
Could be a canon, yeah, could be a canon, but kind of like traditional law, old law, right? Old Roman law, whatever, where they uphold this right and recognize it amongst other colonizing countries. But it's also expressed through the papal bulls, which were issued by the Vatican. And Steve Newcomb, who I believe is probably the preeminent scholar on the doctrine of discovery in terms of indigenous peoples, he's a Lenape legal historian, has been working on and studying the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery for as long as I can remember, as long as I've known him, which is probably around 30 or 40 years now. I traveled with him to Seville, Spain, a few years ago, and when we got to Seville, there is the Archive of the Indies. And in the Archive of the Indies, they have the original papal bulls that were issued by the Vatican. And so he convinced the museum director to bring the 1493 papal bulls, one written in May 3rd and one on May 5th. He convinced the museum director that they should allow us to see those papal bulls. It took them 2 days, and eventually they did, and there was a lot of excitement because the museum directors had not even seen those papal bulls. If you want to study the papal bulls, you can study digital versions of the papal rules. But Steve being who he is, and he managed to get them to bring it out, and so they did. They brought it out. And, there it is, one of them, written in Latin. It's written on lambskin, and it folds up to be kind of a portable document, maybe the size of an iPad. Smudges on it. And it says horrible things, like it grants the discovering European colonizer to invade, to vanquish, to take control of, to enslave, to subdue all Saracens and pagans of Christ, right? That's what these things say, issued by the Vatican. And so they were reading it. That's the museum director. He had never seen it. He was reading the text in there, and Steve reads some Latin, and they were kind of reading these documents. And I'm certain we're the only Indigenous people to have ever seen that and survived. Because the opposite is, if you did not agree to surrender to the rule of the crown and to the rule of the cross, you would be killed. And so you think about things like the letters patent, right? From Pope Alexander VI, reserved from the grant of Spain to Spain all lands which had been previously occupied by any other Christian or original nation. So this is a grant of patent. The patent granted Henry VII of England to John Cabot and his sons, authorized them to seek out and discover all islands, regions, provinces whatsoever that may belong to heathens and infidels, and to subdue, occupy, and possess these territories as his vassals and lieutenants. Right, so these are letters patent, and then you wonder, well, what's the origins of the term patent? Where did that come from, right? And we use it today freely, okay? It's in the intellectual property law. It's a fundamental element of industrial property law. We use it today. The grant from Queen Elizabeth to Sir Humphrey Gilbert empowers him to discover such remote and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed by any Christian prince or people, and to hold, occupy, and enjoy the same with all their commodities, jurisdictions, and royalties. Right? And so that's an old process, this idea of discovery, and to claim and rename and to take control of and to benefit from it for yourselves. Move on a little bit. I want to talk about this as a process. Because you might think, well, that was a long time ago. Yeah, that might be in the historical, element of this country, but it's no longer there. But I think it is. And here's why. So first of all, you have the discovery, and there's some kind of act of discovery, a symbolic act, planting of the flag, the throwing of the sand, the tearing up of the grass or something. Something that says, we've arrived, this is now ours. And what Luis Rivera says was that wasn't just an act, empty symbolism. He said, in fact, what was taking place was a religious ritual. He said they're actually baptizing the pagan land and making it Christian. It wasn't just an empty act. And then, of course, there's violence, because you have to do something with the people that are there. Sans, he says, force is an indispensable element for the propagation of civilization. So we know, in the Americas, some say at least 80 million indigenous peoples were killed in Latin America. I don't know what the numbers are for North America. Those are estimates. 80 million people. Violence, force is an indispensable act. Then there's the renaming. Renaming is a denial of the authority of Native people to name the land that they inhabit. Rivera says, in the Christian tradition, the sacrament of baptism and the act of renaming are linked. The pagan name was abandoned and a new one was assumed. In Columbus's case, the islands had pagan names. Therefore, they had to be baptized and Christianed. The hidden meaning of renaming implies an expropriation, the denial of the authority of Native people to name the land they inhabit, and as a result, to possess it. And so when you think about the renaming of everything, right, in our lands, right? My niece is a geographer. She's doing her master's in geography, and one of the works that she's doing is reclaiming place names, because we have to get rid of all these colonial labels on our landscape. And then these changes become instituted within the laws and policies of the new colonial state, right? And Toffler talks about this as a hidden code. He says that in every society there is a hidden code that is a repeating pattern. So those original beliefs now become embedded in the new framework of society, in the laws and policies of society. And so when you want to think about, kind of what's hidden underneath decisions that have been made by the U.S. Supreme Court, say, for instance, with Johnson v. McIntosh, which says that Indigenous peoples can't own their land, they can only occupy their land. Now these new policies are embedded in the code of the U.S. Supreme Court, which now gets played out in this country. And then there's another element, the final element, is that the state can do whatever it needs to change the code, to revise the code, or to make a new one whenever it needs to meet its own needs. So this is referred to as the reason of state. That the state must be saved, whatever forms may be employed to enable one to save it, and that's, full quote on resigning state. And so sometimes if you study what's called federal Indian law, you'll see rabbits being pulled out of the hat, because there's no such thing as a right of occupancy in terms of ownership of land. Okay. Totally inconsistent with what you know as property law. And so the state does whatever it has to do to survive. And so, this is kind of what I want you to think about, is that, there's old roots to the system we live in. There's hierarchies kind of built into the framework. And those of us who are working on social justice issues, environmental justice issues, racial justice issues, kind of have to peel back the layers to see where did it come from. And my position is that it's embedded. It's become embedded, that whole idea of the doctrine of discovery, of racial superiority, of Indigenous peoples being less than human and being dehumanized by a colonial system, is embedded in this country. And that, it's no wonder we struggle. It's no wonder we struggle for land. It's no wonder we struggle for treaty rights and all of these kinds of things, because we're dealing with a patriarchal system. We're matriarchal peoples, by and large, mostly we are, and it's no wonder that struggle is there. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Hopefully this is food for thought for you. Thank you for coming to a talk on biocolonialism, and I really appreciate your attention.
We'll let Dr. Harry field her own questions, so the floor is open.
Thank you,
Yes.
first of all, for coming. I have a hard time in my own mind distinguishing the basic human patterns of learning about what's in nature and finding ways to use it,
Mhm.
all the way up to many of the current uses that I agree are egregious and dangerous. Are there any examples in indigenous societies that you know of societies intentionally limiting and saying, no, here's a boundary, you can't go here, this is off limits for study or activity or use?
Yeah, there's probably many examples of that. I mean, you know, research has historically been a dirty word for Indigenous peoples, and they've been subjected to all kinds of horrible things in the name of research. So yeah, for Indigenous peoples, they're very cautious when people want to come in. And then, of course, with the states assuming that they have the right to be the ultimate deciders about who has access, and that kind of thing makes it, complicates it as well. But yeah, some Indigenous peoples have, for instance, the Grand Traverse Band, Bodava, I believe. Is that correct? They've actually declared their territories patent-free zones. The Pueblos have done something similar. So yes, people are trying to take whatever stance they have to protect what's within their land. I don't know if that answers your question, but. The Black Hills? I'm not sure. I mean, the Black Hills should be protected by treaty.
What if such genetic research could make it very advantageous to the indigenous people, you know, resulting maybe in cures that for disease that could be applied to their people?
Well, if that were to happen, you'd have to see a project structured around a health condition from which they could benefit, right?
Well, like cancer, for instance. I mean, sure, that has to be pretty universal.
Right, but cancer is a complex trait health condition, and you're not going to find a genetic basis for most of the cancers that people suffer from. So things like cancers, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, those kinds of things are complex traits that you're not necessarily going to find a genetic basis for, let alone a cure. So it gets complex, all right? But it has nothing to do with indigeneity either, right? It has nothing to do with indigeneity. It's a human trait that's passed along lineages. And some traits are detectable, like Huntington's, like sickle cell trait, those kinds of things, right? But I mean, that's what people say, well, what if this, you know, is going to benefit all of mankind? But if it was stolen, if it was taken without consent, if it was, you know, people were deceived and coerced, does that make it right? No. Not by your own, but not by the standards of humanity and human research. Ethical conduct of research, that should mean something, right?
During the international conferences where they kind of establish these rules about how to patent and pretty much steal genetic information, was there native, was there indigenous representation, and if so, like how can we like actually get their voices heard, or like, you know, if there was someone there, how do we get the community to actually listen to them?
Yeah, so yeah, there was always indigenous participation and involvement. Some indigenous peoples were brought by states as delegates from their states, and so they can't really go against the state position because they're a bit compromised in that role. And then there's other indigenous advocates who are there who can take a very strong stand. But at the end of the day, Indigenous peoples are considered only observers within the UN process. They're not members. They're not voting members. So they might be able to inform and engage and resist, but at the end of the day, they wouldn't be the decision makers.
So they were only brought symbolically, essentially?
Pardon?
So they were only really brought there symbolically?
No, they're there to engage and to influence and to lobby and to have that effect. But it could be overrun. Yeah.
Are there new research protocols or regulations developing that can prevent something from genetically modified wild rice to happen now?
Not that I know of. Only if there were maybe an agreement between these institutions that were doing that research and the people that they were impacting. But I don't know of any national laws that would require that kind of protection. Not at the domestic level, for sure. For instance, in Hawaii, the agreement was between the Native Hawaiian people and the institution. But at the national level, I mean, you know, we don't have those kinds of protections. I mean, even, you know, it's just say on an issue of whether or not your foods contain genetically modified products, the corporations won out on that argument, so the country is, the FDA is not required to tell you that your food contains GMO product because it's considered, there's a term that it's considered the same as a genetically modified product is considered substantially equivalent to a non-GMO product. If it looks like a tomato, it's a tomato. And so therefore, they don't have to tell you that it's a GMO tomato. Okay, so the lobby is so powerful in this country that they don't even have to tell you what's in your food. That's why you see labels being put on food that will tell you that it contains no GMO, right? And that's a voluntary effort by companies that are trying to provide organic or non-GMO food products for you. But in this country, no, we're kind of, you know, we're pretty gung-ho on GMO products here.
So I wanted to pursue the line of interest among what are things that are being done on the ground today between Indigenous people and researchers, short of law and convention, so individual projects that are happening in different places. But and I had a specific question to you about, for example, your experiences and what you make of the prospects for like the SING project, the Summer Institute for Native Genomic Research, that some of you have been involved in helping put into place, right? But before like pursuing that line of questioning about the good things that can come out of collaboration and things like that, I'm anxious about that because in some ways it's too easy to want to talk about that really quickly. It's because that issue of where Indigenous people are collaborating with researchers has the ability to obfuscate a lot of what you're talking about, right? I mean, there's already a lot that one has to work around in order to just think and talk about. So it's not as if you can just come into that conversation. It's not just, oh, I want to be a good researcher. How do we do it? We got to deal with history, but we also have to deal with how it's been embedded. You know, how the different ways, for example, that the doctrine of discovery continues to inform everyday academic practice. And we don't know that. And presumptions about what we think is an original idea, when in fact that's an idea that's really problematic, and there's a long history of colonial relations around that. You know, so I don't know, I want to ask you about what are the prospects, but I'm also cognizant that it's also a really fraught place, and you don't just go through it so easily, lest we forget about the politics and the unequal relations that are still happening. Maybe I'll just leave it to you about how would you work your way around something like that, because the relations of power are real thick,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to talk about tomorrow. No, I mean, that's why we have awesome works by people like Dr. Tuhiwai Smith, decolonizing research methodologies, right? You know, we have to decolonize research methodologies so that we have research that benefits Indigenous peoples, where Indigenous peoples are the center of, and the driving forces within the research. They're defining the research question on issues that matter to them. They're putting their expertise and their skills and their knowledge to work. They're developing long-term relationships with the people they work with. They're not doing helicopter science. You know, research can be done well, it can be done meaningfully, and it can have positive, beneficial outcomes, and it can lead to new research, right? And new knowledge development. And so it's how you do it, right? That's what you're asking, is how does it get done? And I'm absolutely saying that it can be done right, but it takes a reframing of what we're used to, a reframing of, you know, kind of the hegemony of Western science being the be-all, end-all, and this pitiful little, you know, quaint knowledge being put down here. Well, no, they're equal. And in fact, maybe one might outweigh the other if we're looking at real deep knowledge about different things, right? So, you know, there's a lot that comes into play with the, you know, the kind of the Western colonial approach to research, to knowledge development, and all of that needs to be addressed to have at least equitable research, but to have decolonized research, that's a conversation that Indigenous researchers need to have for themselves. Hope that answers your question.
As far as...
I'm sorry, there's somebody over on that side of this.
Well, I'm thinking about the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and your comment regarding Indigenous activists having the consultative status at the UN. And I'm wondering if there's a space or opportunity for Indigenous leaders who've been at the UN, you know, moving and shaking it up, as well as, you know, on the development of these treaties, to somehow be able to reframe the narrative, really focused on those Indigenous leaders who have been pushing forward, and what might that look like to really tell the history, because I think oftentimes then, how do we tell what really has been done?
Yeah, that's a loaded question because, you know, Indigenous peoples have been at the UN actually since the 1920s, when the first delegations of Maori and Haudenosaunee people went. But in 1977 is when Indigenous peoples went in force to the United Nations in Geneva, and have been there ever since, and working and creating different instruments and different presences and different UN agencies and bodies. And so there's a lot of work that's been done. It's been a rocky road, right? But at the end of the day, I guess, you know, there's been some gains, and there's also been some terrible losses at the United Nations. And I think one of the reasons goes back to what I talked about in terms of the reason state, right? These are member states that are going to do whatever they have to do to protect their rights and interests. And in one of the old films about UN advocacy, Indigenous people's advocacy at the UN, I think it's Jimmy Durham, is quoted as saying, you know, he said, unfortunately, no state has been able to take up our cause, the cause of the indigenous peoples, because they are there for their own self-interest, right? We don't have someone who can be our advocate, to be our ally, to be our strength at the United Nations level, because we're not their interest, right? So indigenous peoples have been very strong in creating spaces and creating outcomes at the international level. And that's really important because that's where international standards are set. And that gets implemented at the domestic level. So, you know, that work has to continue, and there has been great work in many different places. But at the same time, there's been a narrowing down of places to work, right? And the ability to have real meaningful engagement has kind of been narrowed down and constrained. But that's really a complex conversation to have, to see where those places have been. But yeah, there's definitely important work that's done there. So I'm just saying, from the working group days, you know, within the human rights bodies, there was a lot more freedom and a lot more ability to address real critical issues related to land, self-determination, you know, genocide. But those spaces have been narrowed down now, and the mandates of these different fora that address indigenous issues have been narrowed down, so the space and the constraints are there, so that we can't go in and talk about treaties anymore. Where do you take it, right? You can't go in and talk about genocide anymore. Where do you take it, you know?